Charlotte Hayes paid $1 for the house the whole town refused to talk about. The single mother and chief executive believed she had simply rescued a crumbling property before the city could tear it down. But on the night of the survey, Mason Carter, a single father hired to inspect the bones of the place, found a staircase leading to a steel door that appeared on no blueprint in the city archive. When Charlotte tried an old key pulled from beneath the floorboards, the lock gave way. Inside waited no antiques, only files stamped with her own company's name. If you want to know what that locked room was hiding, stay with this story. The real secret is beginning. The story began on a gray autumn morning in Columbus, Ohio, when Charlotte Hayes walked into a municipal auction hall to study a neighborhood, not to buy a house. Hayes Urban Renewal was preparing to launch a massive redevelopment of the Ashford district, and Charlotte wanted to see the properties the city had seized for unpaid taxes before her company committed tens of millions of dollars to the project. She expected spreadsheets and cold numbers. She did not expect to feel anything standing in that drafty hall. At 38, Charlotte had spent nearly a decade running a company built on her father's name, and she had learned to walk into rooms like this one without letting her face show a single thought. She was a single mother, though almost no one at the auction would have guessed it. Her private life stayed locked away as carefully as any of the properties on the docket that morning, tucked behind a schedule that left almost no seam for anyone to slip through. Then the address came up on the projector screen. 417 Ashford Street, a three-story Victorian built at the turn of the last century, its windows shattered, its rooflines sagging, ivy strangling the porch columns until the wood beneath had gone soft and gray. Every investor in the room glanced at the photograph and looked away. Nobody raised a paddle. Nobody wanted the liability of a house that far gone. The city offered it for $1, on the condition that whoever took it either restored the structure to code or tore it down properly within a set window of time. Charlotte lifted her paddle before she had fully decided to. The room went quiet, then moved on to the next lot as though nothing unusual had happened. She sat with the strangeness of her own decision for the rest of the auction, only half listening as other properties changed hands for far more sensible sums. Something about the shape of that house, the way its roofline sagged like a shoulder that had carried too much for too long, had reached past every instinct she trusted in a boardroom. Jackson Reed, her longtime chief financial officer, leaned toward her immediately. He called it a meaningless gesture, warned that repair costs could easily outstrip whatever the land itself was worth. Charlotte signed the transfer papers anyway. She did not tell him that the address had tugged at something buried in her memory, a name she had once glimpsed written in her grandmother Eleanor's old ledger, tucked away in a box nobody in the family ever opened. She told herself it was coincidence. Columbus was full of old streets and older houses. That same afternoon, she called an independent structural engineer the city had recommended, a man named Mason Carter. He arrived in a battered pickup truck, wearing work boots instead of a suit, and he was entirely unimpressed by her title. He circled the foundation, crouched at the cracks running along the brick, and finally straightened up. "The house is worse than it looks," he told her, "but it might not need to come down." That was the moment Charlotte began paying attention to him. Mason was not trying to flatter her or sell her an expensive repair contract. He simply told her what he saw without softening it and without inflating it. Mason Carter was 42, a structural engineer who had once worked for one of the largest construction firms in the state before starting his own small inspection company. He was a father raising his children largely alone, and he carried the same quiet self-sufficiency in his work that he carried everywhere else. He had no patience for projects built to hide a flaw rather than fix it, and something in the way he studied the old house told Charlotte he had already sensed there was more wrong with it than cracked plaster. Near the end of the visit, Mason stood on the sidewalk and studied the third-floor windows. One of them had been bricked over completely, sealed shut from the outside. He checked the city's original blueprint on his tablet. According to the drawing, that exact spot should have been an open room with a window facing the street. If a room existed there, he asked quietly, why was there no way to reach it from anywhere inside the house? The next day, Charlotte and Mason returned to begin a detailed inspection. Their manner with each other stayed strictly professional at first. Charlotte was used to giving instructions to hundreds of employees without pushback. Mason had a habit of stopping her cold whenever she stepped toward a section of floor that would not hold her weight. Small frictions passed between them, nothing more than the beginning of an easy familiarity neither one named yet. Charlotte found herself irritated the first 2 times he told her to stand back, and then quietly grateful the third time, when a floorboard gave a hollow groan under her boot, exactly where he had warned her not to walk. She said nothing about it. Mason did not gloat. He only moved a folding ladder into place and kept working, as though the moment had not happened at all, and something about that restraint settled a little more of her guard. Mason found that the main staircase had been rebuilt roughly 2 decades earlier, the joinery newer than the surrounding wood. Farther down, the second-floor hallway narrowed in a way that made no structural sense. He ran a laser measure between the exterior wall and the interior hallway wall and found nearly 8 feet of space unaccounted for. Charlotte pulled up the city's archived floor plans on her laptop. The original drawing from 1958 showed a bedroom at the end of that hallway. A renovation filing from 1999 showed the room simply gone, absorbed into nothing, with no permit on record for the wall that replaced it. Mason knocked along the plaster. The sound behind it was hollow. Charlotte wanted to break through immediately. Mason refused, warning that old wiring sometimes ran behind sealed walls and that cutting blind could be dangerous. He reminded her that the house had already stood empty for years, and whatever waited behind that plaster had waited long enough to be found carefully instead of carelessly. She backed down, though she paced the hallway while he worked, unable to sit still the way she usually could through the longest board meetings. While removing a section of baseboard to check for cable, he found a shallow cavity built into the framing. Inside sat a tarnished brass key. A small metal tag was wired to the shank, stamped with 2 letters, E.H. Charlotte went still. Those were her grandmother's initials, Eleanor Hayes. Mason noticed the change in her but did not press. She admitted, almost against her will, that Eleanor had lived in Columbus as a young woman, though the family rarely spoke of that chapter of her life, and never with any detail. Mason suggested they pause the physical search and look into the property's legal history before going further. Charlotte agreed, but as they turned to leave, Mason caught a thin metallic seam behind a curling strip of old wallpaper. He peeled back a corner. A steel door sat behind it, cut cleanly into the plaster, nothing like the rest of the house. The key fit. Charlotte turned it. The lock gave a single, deliberate click, and the door swung inward on hinges that had clearly been oiled sometime in recent memory. Cold air and the smell of aging paper rolled out to meet them. Inside sat dozens of file boxes, a small desk, a map cabinet, and an old cassette recorder. No gold, no hidden cash, no treasure of any kind. On the box nearest the door, someone had written by hand, Hayes Development, Ashford Acquisitions. Charlotte felt the floor tilt beneath her. Hayes Development was the old name of her own company, the one it had carried before she was even born. She reached out and touched the handwriting on the box as though it might tell her something the letters themselves could not. Mason stood back and let her have the moment, watching the dust drift through the flashlight beam like something disturbed after a very long sleep. Neither of them spoke for a while. The room felt less like a discovery and more like a door that had been waiting for the right person to knock. Charlotte wanted to carry the boxes straight to her office. Mason stopped her at the threshold. If the room turned out to be connected to a legal dispute, moving documents without a proper record could strip them of any evidentiary value. He photographed the space exactly as they found it, numbered each box, and told her to call an outside attorney rather than her own company's legal department. That suggestion irritated her. She asked why. Mason answered plainly. If her company's name was written on boxes locked inside a secret room, she did not yet know who at that company could be trusted. The remark landed harder than he intended. It reminded her of Jackson's strange unease the moment she'd raised her paddle at the auction, the way his voice had sharpened just slightly, like a man watching a door he thought had been sealed shut for good swing open again. She had brushed it off at the time as simple caution. Now it sat differently in her memory. She called David Bennett, a retired real estate attorney whose name appeared repeatedly in the property's old ownership records. When Charlotte gave him the address, David went silent for a long moment. Then he asked whether she had opened the room upstairs yet. Charlotte looked at Mason. David already knew it existed. He agreed to meet them but asked that she tell no one at Hayes Urban Renewal beforehand, a request that told Charlotte more than his words did about how seriously he still regarded whatever had happened in that district decades earlier. While they waited, Charlotte and Mason read through the unsealed files, working by flashlight since the power in the house had never been restored, the two of them sitting on overturned crates like students cramming for an exam neither had expected to take. They learned that roughly 25 years earlier, Hayes Development had tried to acquire the entire Ashford district to build a commercial complex. Most residents sold. A small group refused. Shortly afterward, a wave of those same holdout properties were abruptly declared structurally unsafe, and their values collapsed almost overnight. Charlotte's stomach turned. She had inherited this company from her father and the shareholders before him. She had always assumed its history was clean. One folder held a stack of structural condemnation reports. Mason read through them and immediately spotted the pattern. Several houses had been flagged for nearly identical defects, using language copied almost word for word between reports, the same phrases about failing joists and compromised foundations appearing again and again as though someone had simply changed the address at the top of the page. "No engineer working in good faith writes it that way," he said, setting the pages down with the kind of quiet anger that came from a man who had built his entire career on refusing to do exactly what these reports had done. Near the bottom of the stack, Charlotte found a list of households that had refused to sell. Beside one name, someone had scrawled a note in red ink, the handwriting hurried and slanted, nothing like the careful type of the report itself. Apply pressure through tax lien. The owner of that particular house was Eleanor Hayes. Her grandmother, whose face Charlotte had only ever known from a single faded photograph kept on her mother's mantel. A woman she had always imagined as gentle and unremarkable, never once as someone who had stood directly in the path of a corporation willing to ruin her. David Bennett arrived at the house that evening, older than Charlotte remembered from photographs but sharp in every way that mattered, his eyes moving over the front facade like a man greeting someone he had not seen in a very long time. He confirmed that Eleanor had indeed once owned 417 Ashford Street. Charlotte was stunned. Her family had never mentioned it, not once, not even in passing, not at a holiday table, or in the quiet moments after a funeral when old stories were supposed to surface. The truth came out slowly. Eleanor had not been an accidental victim of the scheme. She had worked as a junior accountant inside Hayes Development itself. When she discovered that certain executives were using falsified inspection reports to force families into selling their land for far less than it was worth, she began quietly copying the files that proved it. She then bought 417 from an elderly resident who was about to be forced out entirely, keeping the property outside the company's reach. Eleanor intended to expose the whole arrangement. Before she could, she was threatened, quietly and without a single piece of paper that could ever prove it, the kind of pressure David said was common in those years, and nearly impossible to fight from the position of a low-level employee with no money behind her. David had helped her set up a legal structure that kept the house shielded from any claim Hayes Development might make. Soon after, Eleanor left Columbus and never spoke of it to her own family again. Charlotte asked why the documents were still sitting in that room at all. David told her that Eleanor once said if Hayes Development ever returned to Ashford, the house itself would decide which of her descendants deserved to learn the truth. Charlotte began to understand something far more unsettling. The very project her company was preparing to launch was the Ashford Renewal Project. It was no coincidence that this particular house had resurfaced right before the plan was approved. Mason compared the old survey maps against the current development plans and found that the 417 lot sat directly at the strategic center of 3 parcels her company had not yet fully secured. Jackson had pushed repeatedly for Charlotte to authorize an eminent domain purchase through an intermediary firm. She had never signed off on it. Now she understood exactly why he kept pushing. If 417 Ashford were examined closely, the entire history of the district could be reopened. The romance between them stayed quiet, almost accidental. Charlotte admitted to Mason that years of running a company had taught her to question everyone's motives before trusting them. Mason told her he had left a large construction firm himself years earlier rather than sign off on a dishonest engineering report. They recognized in each other the same stubborn principle, arrived at from entirely different lives. Near the end of the evening, the power in the house cut out without warning, plunging the whole a darkness thick enough that Charlotte instinctively reached for the nearest wall to steady herself. Mason looked through the front window and saw a black SUV parked across the street, its headlights off, its engine idling low enough to be almost silent. When he stepped outside to check, the vehicle pulled away immediately, tires barely making a sound against the wet asphalt. The next morning, Charlotte received an email from Jackson. "I hear you found something upstairs," it read. No one outside Charlotte, Mason, and David knew about the room. Charlotte went into the office the next morning and acted as though she had discovered nothing of consequence, forcing herself through the same routine she followed every day: coffee, calendar, morning briefing, as though her whole world had not tilted sideways the night before. When Jackson asked about the house, she told him it was just old furniture. He looked visibly, almost transparently relieved, a small unguarded moment that told her more than any document in that hidden room ever could. She began quietly reviewing the Ashford project files on her own. A company called Northbridge Holdings had been buying up delinquent tax debt across the district for the past 3 years. The signature on the filings did not belong to Jackson, but the registered address for Northbridge matched a law office that had handled work for him in the past. Meanwhile, Mason kept working through the hidden room. Behind a file cabinet, he found another small compartment holding cassette tapes and one of Eleanor's personal notebooks. One tape was labeled in her handwriting, "If they come back for Ashford." Charlotte and Mason listened together. Eleanor's voice described a group of Hayes development executives who had once built an entire system for driving down land prices through fear and paperwork. But she was careful to add something else. "This isn't only history," her recorded voice said. "These records will become dangerous again if someone decides to use the same method twice." Charlotte finally understood. Jackson was not hiding an old crime to protect the company's reputation. He was running the same scheme again, in the present, through Northbridge, buying tax debt to depress property values so Hayes Urban Renewal could later acquire the whole district cheaply. Once the project won approval, Northbridge would collect an enormous profit on the parcels it controlled in between. Charlotte had become the legal, public face of a plan she had never approved. She felt the betrayal settle into her chest like a stone, heavy in a way that no failed deal or hostile investor had ever managed to make her feel. She had spent 9 years trusting Jackson with numbers she barely double-checked, believing that trust was the price of running a company too large for one person to watch every corner of. Mason did not offer hollow comfort. Instead, he told her that she could not undo what the company had already done, but she still had the power to decide what it would do next. That was the moment Charlotte began to see him as something more than the engineer she had hired. They returned to the house later that day and found the front door had been forced open. The wood around the lock splintered in a way that made Charlotte's stomach drop before she had even stepped inside. The secret room upstairs was still locked. But one box was missing, the one that held the Northbridge Holdings records, and its absence told her that whoever had broken in already knew exactly what they were looking for. Charlotte wanted to call the police immediately. Mason agreed, but pointed out that whoever broke in might not realize how much of the material had already been copied, which meant the missing box was less of a loss than it first appeared. Together with David and an outside attorney, they filed an official report, photographing the splintered doorframe and the empty shelf where the box had sat. Police opened an investigation into the break-in, though there was not yet enough evidence to tie it directly to Jackson, and Charlotte understood that suspicion alone would never be enough to move against a man who had spent decades learning exactly how far the law's reach extended. Charlotte decided to set a trap of her own. During a board meeting, she announced that the house was too damaged to save and would be demolished after one final inspection. She mentioned, almost in passing, that some old paperwork remained inside not yet digitized. Jackson showed no reaction at all. That night, a hidden camera recorded someone entering the house. It was not Jackson, it was Ryan Blake, the company's director of land acquisition. Police detained him as he attempted to remove documents from the property. At first, he said nothing. Once his attorney showed him the camera footage alongside the transfer records tied to Northbridge, Ryan began to cooperate. He admitted that Jackson had orchestrated the entire scheme. Worse, Jackson had already built a plan to shift blame onto Charlotte if the project ever came under investigation, since every acquisition decision carried her electronic signature. Charlotte realized her career could collapse even though she had done nothing wrong. Mason found a detail that might save her. The technical reports used to undervalue the current round of properties had metadata showing they were created on a private Northbridge server before ever being entered into the Hayes Company system. That meant the false data existed before Charlotte had approved anything. It was proof that she had been fed fabricated information from the start, a distinction that mattered enormously to any investigator willing to look closely enough at the timestamps buried inside the files. Working through the night, something between them shifted further. The office around them had gone silent hours earlier, the only sound the occasional hum of the refrigerator down the hall, and the soft rustle of paper as Mason worked through another folder. Charlotte drifted off for a few minutes in her chair, exhaustion finally winning out over the adrenaline of the day. Mason draped his jacket over her shoulders and kept reading through the files without waking her. When she opened her eyes, she looked at the jacket for a long moment and simply smiled. There was no confession of feeling, no dramatic pause in the mystery. Near the end of the night, Jackson called her directly. He already knew Ryan had been taken in. "You think that house is going to save you," he said. "That house is what's going to destroy the Hayes name." Jackson moved to a public attack. He called an emergency board meeting and accused Charlotte of concealing a conflict of interest. Her grandmother, he pointed out, had once owned 417 Ashford Street. Charlotte had personally acquired it for $1. Soon after, she had paused a project worth tens of millions. On the surface, it looked exactly like a chief executive using her authority to protect a piece of family history, and Jackson had built his case with the same precision he had once used to build the very scheme now threatening to unravel around him. Jackson called for her suspension. Several board members wavered, unsettled by the tidy narrative he presented and unaware of everything sitting inside a locked steel door on Ashford Street. Charlotte faced a choice. She could stay quiet and let the lawyers manage it internally. Or she could lay out the entire history in the open, which meant admitting that the company carrying her family's name had once engaged in genuinely corrupt practices. She chose the second path. She asked Mason to present the technical findings. He walked into the boardroom in the same work boots he had worn the first day at the house, entirely unbothered by the row of executives watching him. He did not speak about her personally or try to defend her character. He simply laid out, report by report, the falsified inspection language, the metadata discrepancies, and the unmistakable pattern of manipulated valuations, his voice as level as it had been the very first time he told Charlotte the house was worse than it looked. David then confirmed the authenticity of Eleanor's original documents, his testimony carrying the quiet weight of a man who had waited 25 years to say these words out loud. Finally, Charlotte stood. She announced that the Ashford Renewal Project was suspended effective immediately. Every transaction connected to Northbridge Holdings was frozen. An independent financial audit would be opened. If Hayes Urban Renewal had profited unfairly from any Ashford household, the company would establish a restitution fund for those families. Jackson smiled thinly and warned that the decision would send the stock price falling. "Then let it fall," Charlotte said. That single moment completed something in her. She had chosen accountability over image. But Jackson still had one card left. He produced documents showing that Charlotte's own father had signed several of the original agreements decades earlier. The blow landed harder than anything else that day. She had idolized her father her entire life. After the meeting, Charlotte sat alone inside the Ashford house. Mason arrived but said nothing at first. He simply sat beside her. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Maybe my family was never who I thought they were," she said. "Your family is the past," Mason answered. "You are the decision you're making right now." It was a small step forward for them both, restrained, unhurried, but unmistakable. Charlotte returned to the secret room one last time to understand her father's role in all of it, climbing the same staircase that had once felt like a mystery and now felt almost like a second home. A drawer that had been jammed shut since the very beginning finally came loose under Mason's careful work, the old wood giving way with a groan that seemed to echo the years it had spent sealed. Inside sat an envelope addressed to her father by name, the ink faded but still legible after all this time. Its contents changed everything she thought she understood. Her father had indeed signed the earliest agreements, but he later discovered the scheme to force down land prices and tried to stop it from the inside. Jackson, then a young finance employee, had been working directly under the group of senior executives running the operation. Eleanor had secretly passed her documentation to her own son, Charlotte's father, and the two of them had planned to bring the whole arrangement into the open. But the company reached quiet settlements with several of the affected families, and the matter was buried before it ever became public. Her father later reformed much of the company's practices, but he never told his own daughter the truth, afraid it might damage the future he wanted for her, choosing instead to carry the weight of it alone for the rest of his life. His greatest mistake was never removing Jackson from the organization entirely, a decision Charlotte suspected he must have wrestled with more than once and ultimately let go, perhaps believing that time alone would dissolve whatever ambition Jackson still carried. Jackson had waited for years. Once Charlotte became chief executive, He steadily gained control over the finance division and quietly rebuilt the Northbridge network from the ground up. The final piece of evidence was an old transaction ledger whose signatures and account codes matched the very system Jackson was still using. Investigators now had enough to open a much broader case. Jackson was removed from the company and faced investigation for fraud, falsified records, and manipulation of land transactions. None of it resolved cleanly or easily. Charlotte still paid a price. The project stalled. Investors pulled back. Reporters dug into the buried history of Hayes' development all over again, printing old photographs of Ashford Street alongside headlines that made her family name feel unfamiliar in her own mouth. Charlotte chose to face the press herself and accept responsibility for cleaning up a mess she had not personally created, standing on a small platform in front of cameras with her chin level and her voice steady. Mason stood at the back of the crowd during the press conference, never stepping onto the platform beside her. She found him with her eyes anyway. That was enough to steady her through the rest of it. 6 months later, 417 Ashford Street had not been torn down. Charlotte transferred ownership of the house out of her personal name and into an independent community trust, a decision that surprised the board far less than it once would have, given everything that had come before. The first floor became a free legal advisory office for homeowners facing property disputes, staffed by volunteer attorneys David had personally recruited from his old firm. The second floor was restored into a small archive documenting the district's history, its walls lined with photographs of the families who had once called Ashford home. The hidden room itself was kept partly intact, preserved as evidence of what had once happened there. Hayes' urban renewal reshaped the Ashford project entirely. Instead of buying out the whole neighborhood, the company shifted to a model that let residents retain ownership and share in future profits from redevelopment, a structure Charlotte had spent long nights building with a small team she trusted completely, checking every clause against the very tactics her own company had once used against these same families. Charlotte accepted a far smaller margin than she once would have, but the revised plan finally earned the community's trust, something no spreadsheet could have measured but that she felt every time she walked down Ashford Street and residents nodded to her instead of looking away. Mason became an independent structural consultant for the project, turning down the leadership role Charlotte offered him more than once. He wanted to keep the right to tell her no when it mattered, a boundary he explained to her plainly one evening over coffee, without any trace of resentment in his voice, only conviction. "You seem to enjoy telling a chief executive no," Charlotte said one afternoon, smiling. "Only the ones who need to hear it," he answered. That was when the romance finally opened, gently and without drama. There was no sudden declaration, no rushed proposal, nothing staged for effect. After months of working side by side, they began sharing coffee after work. Sometimes they talked about nothing related to the project at all. Their children were mentioned only briefly in passing after the two families happened to cross paths at a neighborhood picnic. It never became a storyline of its own. Charlotte realized that Mason had never once treated her like a title. Mason realized that Charlotte was nothing like the cold executive the business press liked to describe, a portrait he had believed himself once, before he ever set foot inside that drafty house on a gray autumn morning. What they had built together, slowly and without ceremony, felt sturdier for having grown out of something so ordinary. 1 year after the auction, Charlotte and Mason stood in front of 417 Ashford Street on the day the restored building officially reopened. The Victorian facade had been rebuilt, though every brick that could be saved had been kept in place, a decision Charlotte had insisted on even when the contractor told her it would be cheaper to start fresh. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some of them the very families whose names had once appeared in that red ink notation decades earlier, now standing on a lawn that belonged to no single owner at all. A reporter asked Charlotte whether this was the best real estate deal she had ever made, pen already hovering over a notepad, expecting the kind of polished quote executives usually gave on days like this one. She looked at the house for a long moment. She had bought it for $1. Restoring it had cost her company millions, forced her to confront her own family's history, and nearly cost her the position she had spent her whole career building. "This wasn't my best deal," she finally said. "It was the deal that taught me what a property is actually worth." After the crowd thinned out, Mason was closing the door to the hidden room. Charlotte asked if he planned to lock it. He said the lock no longer meant anything now that the room held no more secrets. He slid the brass key free and handed it to her. The small tag still read E.H., the metal worn smooth by decades of handling long before either of them had ever touched it. Charlotte studied it for a moment, then set it inside a display case beside Eleanor's notebook rather than keeping it for herself. The past did not need to be owned. It only needed to be remembered. As they walked down the front steps, Charlotte asked what Mason had planned for the evening. He said nothing yet. She looked at him and offered to take him to dinner instead. "Is that the chief executive asking?" he said, "or Charlotte?" "Charlotte," she answered. They walked away from the house together. No grand promise passed between them, no storybook ending. Only two people who had spent far too long living by obligation finally allowing themselves to begin something new, walking down a street that no longer belonged to a company or a scheme, but simply to the people who lived along it. The $1 house never made Charlotte Hayes wealthier. It simply opened a door her family had kept locked for 25 years, and once that door swung open, she finally understood who she wanted to become. What began as a $1 transaction ended up rewriting everything Charlotte Hayes believed about her own family, her own company, and her own name. The house on Ashford Street was never really about property values or corporate secrets. It was about a woman willing to open a locked door even when everything inside told her to walk away, and a man who taught her that the truth, however uncomfortable, was always worth more than a comfortable lie. If this story stayed with you, ask yourself what locked rooms might still be waiting in your own family history, and whether you would have the courage to turn that key. Sometimes the smallest purchase of a lifetime is the one that costs only $1 and changes absolutely everything that comes after it.